and welcome everyone. My name is Michelle James, and I am the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. Today, we are continuing our series, Our Public Health Future Starts Now, with a discussion on space, satellites, and disaster response. This series offers an opportunity for public health leaders, practitioners, and students to consider the ever-changing landscape of public health and what the future holds for us. Today, our speakers will explore the fascinating intersection of space, satellites, and remote sensing capabilities with public health, aiming to shed light on how these technological advances can revolutionize public health at the local, regional, and global levels, from improving disaster response and preparedness to enhancing the understanding of climate change and its implications for public health. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to Niles Friedman, Executive Advisor with Star Insights and President-elect of the Rollins Alumni Board. At Star Insights, Niles specializes in creating and growing businesses, divisions, and core functions within organizations by building an adaptable approach to strategically collaborate across sectors, industries, and geographies. Through his work with executives, startup founders, public sector administrators, boards, and nonprofits. Over the last 15 years, Niles has emphasized public sector innovation and digital transformation across the U.S., federal government, and the state of California, Los Angeles County, numerous cities, and international health agencies. And with that, I think I have lost Niles.
We may. Is Niles, are you there? If not, then I might pick up the hot potato.
I think
all right, we're just going to roll with it because we're
going to roll with it. David, I'm going to just give it to you instead.
Absolutely.
This is where we talk about the first part of what our series was, disaster response. What do you do when the internet hiccups? So with that, thank you, Michelle, and we'll give a salute to Niles with the hope that he can come back. I am honored to actually welcome two of our distinguished guests here, both Ali and Selena, who are going to help us explore this space together. Specifically, how can public health benefit from what really has been over the last decade a revolution when it comes to what commercial satellites are possible in terms of what they can do, capable of doing, and the data they can do to help inform public health. With that, though, I am honored first and foremost to go to Dr. Ali Khan, who I had the distinguished pleasure of working with way back in the 2001, 2002, 2003 era, again, when I was doing my PhD back in 2005, 2006. But Ali, you've obviously seen public health go through multiple transformations. I was wondering if you could maybe set the scene before we go to Selena, and if you could set the scene, Ali, and share for us how you think public health has been transformed, and then similarly, what does it need now given the changing world?
So, thank you, David. As I think about what I've been seeing in public health over the last 30 years, increasingly I'm using the word planetary health. And I think that's sort of just that the way we're all sort of adopting that phrase sort of goes to the scope of how we think about public health around driving our responses and around driving prevention-related activities, to think holistically about not just our planet, but holistically about data, how we get that data, collate that data, and use that data. So I think the planetary health, obviously, for climate change, et cetera, the next pandemic, those concepts are super important. But I think the evolution is also paramount to how we're thinking about public health moving on.
So, Ali, maybe if I could sort of tease a little bit more about what you're seeing there, because I think you're actually spot on when you talk about planetary health. Could you talk a little bit about, are we seeing, for example, that as climate change happens, there may be impacts both in terms of what pathogens, be they viruses or bacteria, are rising, but also health needs, public health needs when it comes to food and water as a result too. So maybe if you could unpack that a little bit for our listeners.
Glad to. And I always remind people climate change is now. It's not that we're just waiting for climate change to happen. What we're waiting for is increasing impacts of climate change as we fail to put measures into place to limit climate change. But no, the impacts of climate change are seen currently. There's great reports on deaths that we see currently due to mainly around heart and lung disease, due to the pollutants within our air. There was a recent summary about what's going on with the ocean temperatures rising. So yeah, we see impacts right now. In the U.S., for those of you in the U.S. who are listening to us, I know as I'm an Emory alum, We have Emory alums all over the world. But, you know, if I look at Lyme disease and what has happened to Lyme disease over the last 2 decades, that's climate change. If I look at where mosquito vectors are showing up increasingly up in Canada that used to belong in Florida, I'm like, okay, why are you sort of migrating further north, right? So we are without a doubt seeing impacts currently from climate change. I can talk about wildfires, all sorts of ways that it's now. Climate change is now.
Well said, Ali, and I'm glad you mentioned forest fires, because that was actually something that actually first pulled me into satellites when I had an opportunity in the mid-90s to work for the US government. I couldn't fully say what I was doing at the time, but it was partly using what had been Cold War era satellites with the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization to see if we could use them to actually pick up forest fires. And so now that, of course, that technology is doable not just from space, but also through drones. And so remote sensing is definitely possible. Selena, I don't know if you're in a place where you can actually pick up yet. If not, that's fine. But if you are available and can come on camera, I was wondering if you might be able to share a little bit about your background. If not, then you are available. Recognizing you just came from a 5-sided building, which we will not name, but I was wondering if you might be willing to sort of share a little bit about your background and the work you have been doing when it comes to space, remote sensing, and activities on the ground.
Sure. Thank you, David. So I first started touching geospatial data with a company called Descartes Labs that came out of Los Alamos Labs. And they were truly ahead of their time. And what they were doing was taking in massive amounts of data, of which was space-based data and other data sets, and fusing that together to provide essentially insights. And a lot of that, and what their focus was around humanitarian type issues. They did a lot around agriculture, so like food security. And so they were looking at weather patterns, for example, and how that would affect crops. They'd also look at drought mitigation. They also looked at the problem set with forest fires. So since then, remote sensing and satellites, I mean, the commercial space industry has increased exponentially since then, and that's essentially what I've been involved in. And also taking that space-based data and applying it to areas of the world that we would normally not think has access to this data, and making that data accessible, right? So space-based data can be hard. So SAR data is no joke, right?
I'm 100%. I'm 100%, yes.
Right. And so how do we make that accessible to, the 5-6 billion people that are affected by these really challenging issues? How can they take the data and make it relevant to their challenges? And that's really where I am right now in what I'm providing. So I just got back from Luanda in Angola. They've got a great program where they've been using space-based data, primarily Sentinel and Landsat data, to solve for drought mitigation on where they can direct populations to where there is water. So often we see many humans suffering from drought, and there may be a water supply very close, but you can't see that when you're on the ground. But you certainly can see that water supply from using satellite imagery, and now you can even see it satellite imagery that can penetrate within the Earth's surface to see where potentially there's an aqueduct or other sources of water. So I give that as an example of what you can do now, and I think it's only going to improve in the future.
Well said, Selena, and I'm glad you gave a very specific context about how folks in a local area can benefit from having the data be accessible to them, that it's not just something that's done by people far away that keep the analyses, so to speak. I was wondering, earlier in the series with Emory, we were talking about how in some respects, we may be facing an era in which people's data in some respects is their voice, that their data can speak for them. And if they don't have the ability to have stakeholderism in their data or to influence how the data is employed, they might lose their voice. And so let's think about how we apply that to space, because space is often observations about their region, about their community, and the activities. I was wondering if maybe you could share additional examples. Ali mentioned a little bit about awareness of possible pollution in the area, but there's also things such as like illegal mining or unfortunately human trafficking. These are things that are public health adjacent as well. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about how space might be able to reveal patterns of activity that could actually help on those issues too.
Yes, and thanks for bringing that up. Illegal mining, artisanal mining, is very prevalent, and so how that relates to health. If you can identify artisanal mining activity, usually with artisanal mining activity, it's usually women that suffer in those environments. So you can establish or target public health programs around those artisanal mining sites. I know in DRC, USAID is really looking at this on how they can be more targeted with their programs in country around artisanal mining sites. And usually artisanal mining moves, so it's hard to keep track of it on the ground. So using space-based technology, you can identify these artisanal mining sites as they pop up. The other thing too is, and this is going back to data and who owns the data. With illegal mining, with some adversarial type entities will mine outside of their concession, outside of what is rightfully theirs. And so the ability for a country to be able to track what mining activity is occurring from space that you would not see this on the ground in these remote areas is very powerful, because then that allows for monitoring and then potentially taxing or legal action if these mining operations exploit outside of their concessions. And then finally, I'd also like to say that data is very powerful in especially like around rare earth and critical minerals. You're able to track where these resources are located. And so then the country in question has then got the ability to negotiate in and determine how they best want to exploit what is rightfully theirs, right? They're with the data, satellite imagery, they're in a better position. And then also I would say things that also affect public health, like deforestation and affects the climate. Deforestation is a real issue, and one that can be tracked very effectively through using satellite imagery. And that then has second and third order effects on communities. The last thing with that is the financial benefits that we're seeing using space-based technology is through carbon tracking, right? So the ability to establish carbon banks by recording, taking images from space and recording, how many trees are there, right? And then you're able to establish your carbon credit. Without space-based technology, it's very hard to be able to do that. So again, those are some of the examples of how we can use this technology, or how these emerging countries can use these technologies and their data more effectively to be in more of a negotiating position.
Well said. And I really appreciate the example you gave of watching deforestation and reforestation, because we know, unfortunately, if you rely solely on things on the ground, there's a risk of either double or triple counting the same trees. There's also that not every tree is as good at capturing carbon as others. And so you can actually both make sure you don't double or triple count, And two, you can use hyperspectral or multispectral analyses to actually assess how good really is that tree or carbon sequestration source really operating. And so I think that's a really great example. I'm going to pivot to you, Ali, because I know you probably have some examples also from the work that you do, and see if you want to elaborate on some examples of space and public health.
And thanks, David. And your comment about the voice of data and Selena's about the value of data really resonates to me. At the end of the day, the data, it's got to be data with the purpose, right? You know, if you're collecting all this data, why and what are you doing with the data? And yes, there's been an explosion in the last 10 to 20 years when we think about Earth observation and the number of satellites out there and what they can do. But my personal initial experience with this was in 1997, 1998 with the Rift Valley fever outbreak in Western Kenya. And so Rift Valley fever is a mosquito-borne disease. Usually these mosquito eggs hatch in these shallow pans. They're already infected, and it's mainly a disease of animals, which is a bad thing because it kills animals. And if you're a pastoralist in Western Kenya, that's your 401k account, dropping down to, 90% decline in your 401k account. But it also does cause disease in humans, including hemorrhagic fever. And the first signal for this actually came from NDVI data, from satellite data in those days, with normalized vegetative difference index. And so you can see the vegetation getting greener and greener. And so the people who were monitoring the satellite data were like, there's water here now that was not there before. And you need to think about what is going to happen. And sure enough, an outbreak, not just of Rift Valley fever, we also saw malaria in that region. And so this goes to the prevention point, which is it's expensive to vaccinate animals. But if you know, well, it's coming, then you go, okay, well, it's expensive, but this is a good time now to use my money. And also, if you know if malaria is coming, you can put appropriate prevention strategies in place. And this is now routinely used. Again, the way I say space is now, the same thing, Earth observation for public health is now. This isn't something in the future. We use it all the time currently in public health. That's a Rift Valley fever example, malaria, cholera examples. A couple of state labs are using it for asthma because you can look at pollen within the air and plants. So there's all sorts of interesting ways that we're using satellite data now as just another additional stream of data to layer on others to understand what's going on and use that again around prevention and early response.
And I'm one wonderful example about how even back in the late 90s, there was the ability to actually use this and say something to pay attention to. And like you said, things have only gotten more accessible and available. I want to acknowledge you gave a shout out to one of our CDC colleagues, Rita Caldwell, who's been looking at can you detect cholera from space, and she's been pioneering that domain. It's also worth thinking about, and maybe I'll go maybe first to Selena and then Ali on this question. There also are non-obvious indicators. And so we've been talking about, whether you're seeing the water or you're seeing the actual deforestation or things like that. But there's also patterns of life that do not at any point in time violate anybody's privacy. So if we're not tracking specific people, we're just saying, are we seeing the reflections of more cars in parking lots around hospitals? We know that actually happened with COVID, where there were signs early on in certain parts of China where we saw increased reflectivity of cars in parking lots. We also saw that in other nations too, as it sort of spread. And I can actually say in a past life with severe acute respiratory syndrome, we saw that through more government satellites at the time, but also we could track economic signals. I want to give a shout out to some of our colleagues that used to do bioterrorism preparedness. If the price of garlic goes up in Southeast Asia, people are looking for a cure-all, whether or not it's effective or not. If you're plugged into monitoring over-the-counter drug sales, again, not tracking specific people or what they're buying, you're just saying, am I seeing an increase in the purchases of gastrointestinal medication? That could be bioterrorism, or it could just be a food poisoning outbreak. And so maybe, Selena, if you could talk a little bit about how we can both preserve people's privacy and that we're not tracking specific people, but we can benefit from aggregate patterns of life that we observe on the ground. And then maybe, Ali, if you could also respond to that, that would be great. Over to you, Selena.
Yeah, so I'll use the example of layering in cell phone derivative data, right? It's onto geospatial data. We were doing some of that at the beginning of COVID, and there were real concerns over privacy It was a derivative, so it was, as a group, but it was very powerful data, especially in and around COVID and patterns of life that could be established using that type of data layered in on top of geospatial data was a great story to tell. And I think we remembered, that was, back in 2020, there were some real concerns over privacy. But again, I think as an aggregate, we were able to achieve what we wanted to with the pattern of life, but not targeting. That's a whole nother conversation.
Not doing that, yes.
Correct. But Nigeria has been using that type of technology to track diseases. They used it for COVID as well. They also used it space-based data around their elections. So to kind of monitor patterns of life, who was congregating in and around polling stations, and to determine, how many people were coming out to vote. I know that's not health related, but it is an example of how it can be used, in and around health clinics, for example. When a health clinic usually stands up, there is a congregation of people, so you can best monitor on, what type of services, how much you need to bring by, you're looking at the migration of people, and what services you need to provide in what particular area. But I just wanted to touch on when we're talking about all of these problems, I like to say, there's so many sensors out there, so many satellites. I think there's a lack of education of that, not one satellite solves for all.
Exactly.
And that there's this concept that, we have a satellite, we can do satellite communications. We haven't even talked about the benefits of communication, and see through clouds, and there's all these things that this one satellite can do, but that's just not the case, right? And that these sensors all have a different purpose. And so I like to say, tell me what your X is. So we solve for X. It's not just enough to have like a pretty picture. I remember I was looking at water pollution, and someone sent me, the lake is polluted. I said, yeah, no, I know that. I know the lake's polluted, and that's a pretty picture, but who did the polluting, right? That's where we wanted to get to. That was the X. So it's always like, define your X first, because then you can bring in the right sensor, the right imagery at the right time. And I call this data management, because that's the other thing. Weather patterns make a big difference to what you can see, from a satellite. And so all of this has to be managed, I think, and clearly communicated, and a data strategy put in place when you're trying to solve whatever your X is. And that's, I think, the conversation that we need to have now around what satellite imagery and communications can do, and how we can be more effective with its use. I think we've determined it can do some great things, but we need to say, what is the X?
So Selena, I'm going to extend your solve for X from who did the polluting to using satellite data to say who is impacted by the polluting, right?
Yes.
Because then you can find where's the local population centers, et cetera. I want to do a shout out to to Emory and to the Carter Center, because I believe it was in 2015, the Carter Center reached out to NASA for help mapping some local villages in the Amazon for their river blindness trial. So they needed to know where to go, but it's the Amazon. How do you know where to go, right? So satellite data
Not
can
usually
tell
a
you,
forwarding address.
right. Here's the villages, right? Here's their location.
Yeah.
So how do you use that? And back to your point, Selena, and I think David makes that point often. It's a tool, and we need to remember tools can be used for good purposes. Tools can be used for bad purposes. And yes, we need to make sure we ensure privacy, which is not often an issue for public health issues. But these same tools can be used for search and rescue, where you really do want to use this amazing resolution we now have of these satellites to potentially find somebody out in remote areas, or a boat or a ship that you would not otherwise find. So let's not forget that even when it's not privacy protecting, it can be used to help people. But but for public health purposes, usually it's the aggregate, right? That's what matters to us. Where is the forest fire? How is that impacting people? What is the populations at risk would be an example. I love the economic examples. I've seen lots of those. So for example, supply chains, there are a whole bunch of canisters stocked up somewhere at a port, right? Like, oh, okay, we probably have a little supply chain disruption going on there. We've seen multiple examples. David's given some of COVID. I remember a study I read in Dhaka, I think this was in Bangladesh, where they were looking at shipping fleets, and are people fishing or not, as an example for villages of how the lockdowns are impacting them. So you're correct, Selena. Yes, we love it for public health and healthcare purposes. We've not even talked about telemedicine and other ways that satellite communications help us in remote areas, but there's all sorts of uses for satellite data.
Well, I think you all have pointed out, which is exactly that, which is we need to ask what is the problem we're trying to solve, and this tool can come to bear in a whole variety of settings. I'm going to first remind our audience, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. You have two distinguished experts here that can chime in, and I'm going to go now as I wait to see if any questions arise. First to Ali and to Selena, and say, Ali, if you were to change how we teach public health to begin to embrace these technologies, in fact, you probably are already doing it because I recognize your role, but what would you recommend for the future of public health, and for those that either are currently doing coursework, or maybe they recently graduated, but they want to figure out how they add this to what they do? What would you recommend for how we educate public health practitioners?
So thanks, David, for that shout out. Correct. So here at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, we actually have a very active climate change program that uses a lot of remote sensing data, and a very active health security program that uses remote sensing data. I think as we train public health practitioners, or those who are out of immediate training but want to be retrained, I think it's how to include satellite data within their sort of repertoire of tools that they use. And increasingly, thanks to the quality of the tools, you don't need to be as sophisticated as you needed to be 20 years ago to use satellite data, right? It's become so much easier to use that data, the availability of data, the accessibility, the way to analyze the data. It's a lot more intuitive. Soon, I'm sure AI will make it even easier for all of us to do it. So it's not so much that you need to have those deep GIS tools to do that, as to recognize there are other sources of data that I was not trained on in the past that can now be used to help solve problems that I'm dealing with every day.
Well said. And so now, Selena, I'll turn to you and say, both if you were to make recommendations for how we train public health practitioners, but also recognizing, I mean, some of the things we've been talking about historically, satellites have been the domain of defense, and maybe it's actually helping defense and other national security adjacent fields appreciate what public health is also able to do with this, because, and then after you answer that, maybe we can explore, Ali kicked off by saying climate change is now. Climate change is an issue that's not just a public health issue. It is an economic issue. It's a national security issue. It's an all of us issue. But Selena, first, if I could just ask, what would you recommend for training both people who are public health practitioners, but maybe also in other fields that are aware of satellites, but may not know about public health?
Yeah, so I would say that we need to make access to data, especially space-based data, easy, right? For and I'll, within my own applications, I have developed a platform because I realized that you had to be a data scientist or have Python background to fuse all this data, and then I realized, well, the 6 billion people around the world are just not going to have that, so that takes them out, right? And also from most people that are in these areas, they're just not going to sit at a screen and go through like 1,000 images to determine, what best picture to look at and then make a decision based on that. So we need to, I think, for those public health experts or practitioners that are coming through, provide them with tools that are really easy to use and get access to the data very quickly so that they can get the insights that they need to make a decision, right? That's where I think it's all about, not the actual fact that it's from space, which I often say it's just space enabled, right? I think when we say space, people are like, oh my gosh, we're going to Mars. What? It's overwhelming, right? So these are space enabled decision-making tools. The imagery just happens to be coming from above us. I think from a national security standpoint, public health challenges, health issues around the world, climate change have significant impact on national security. And, I always like to talk about Nigeria and the Middle Belt, and Boko Haram. Most people think that that's a terrorism issue. It is now, but however, it's really routed in resources and a conflict between herders and the agricultural folks that, there's a migration of people, of herders that are coming through the pastoral lands. And of course, the cows and the goats that they bring through trample all of the agricultural, both groups are affected, right? The herders are affected because they're looking for water, because there is no water where they traditionally have existed. And so, that has now created a whole conflict, because there's a battle of resources, which is being brought on by climate change, because there's been a lack of water in the Chad Basin. And, so I know there are studies, I think Arizona State has been doing some studies around why has the Chad Basin declined, in their water levels so much over the last 10 to 20 years. Well, that's now had a national security effect on a whole region. So I think that using this type of data and then applying it to some of these hotspots that we're seeing, we could actually get into a preventative mechanism where we could look at this, run an AI model and say, well, if this, look at another area, if this happens in this area, if there's a lack of water, is there going to be, a fight for resources because of this? So that I think is where we can avoid some of the conflicts in the future by looking and using modeling from space. The last thing I'll say is space-based data I love, because it gives you access into places of the world that you normally wouldn't have access into. And so you get to see things that are just highly unusual. And I use the Gobi Desert from a national security standpoint. When you start seeing triangles occurring in nature, so in the desert, triangles do not occur naturally. They're man-made. So so then you're able to like, what's going on there, right? So I think that there's a lot of those type of scenarios that we can start looking at, of like, okay, so what's actually going on there, and start mitigating and getting in front of some of these challenges and things that are going on from a national security aspect that we should maybe be a little bit more concerned about.
Well said. And I think that this does set, if we haven't got any additional questions from the audience, I'm going to go to Ali and then to you again, Selena, and say, let's talk about sort of exploring some of the intersectionalities in which public health does touch upon issues of global safety and security, You mentioned already, Selena, that when there's water scarcity, that can result in displaced people. We already know there's examples of where people got displaced, and several of them then went as displaced people to Europe. That created tensions in some parts of Europe that are now still being dealt with on a regional scale there. There's a stat that says now within our lifetimes, 1 in 4 of us will be a displaced person for more than 3 months. That includes us in the United States as a result of either forest fires or hurricanes or flooding. And so it's not just a developing economy issue, it is increasing an issue for all of us that we may be displaced. And so there's also the challenge of there's going to be splashover events as rising sea levels happen. There's going to be some places that won't be underwater, but there are examples where there's actually like the Marshall Islands, where the prediction is by 2040, 2045, within that time frame, they will have, unfortunately, don't have so many splashover events where salt water will contaminate the potable water table that they'll have to leave those islands. And you can just imagine if you're being asked to leave where you and your ancestors have lived for generations, how that's going to create tensions, and then where do you go? So maybe, Ali, obviously you've worked at the intersection of issues that were public health, but also relating to just public safety and international global security with bioterrorism and the like. If you were to sort of make a recommendation, since we do have changes afoot both in the United States and abroad, but to decision makers about how they think about the intersections of public health and these issues. And again, recognizing that space-based data, I love how you said, Selena, it's space enabled, but that we could use these tools to get ahead of it and to get left of boom of these issues so that we're not just dealing with the after effects, but we're actually in the adaptation and mitigation business. Maybe, Ali, you get to be president or prime minister or UN secretary general for the day. What would you recommend? And then I'll go to Selena with the same question.
I would remind politicians that historically, specifically droughts, I love the fact that you brought up drought, Selena, is that natural disasters, man-made disasters lead not just to population displacements, but lead to political movements and political change. And so whatever their third thoughts may be about public health, if they value their positions as leaders, they better pay attention to this, right? Because we've seen in multiple countries where for example, in the United States, after a poorly managed natural disaster, we saw a lot of political change associated with the poorly managed natural disaster. So I like the fact, David, that you mentioned person displacement does not just occur in low and middle income countries. I mean, when we responded to Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of population displacement that happened right here in the United States. So I think it's that reminder. Droughts are a good example. We'll give you other examples that if you don't manage to these issues, there will be political disruption. And so it makes sense. Security is a critical component of being a leader, right? If you're head of a country, you got to make sure people are secure, and it's secure from everything. And that's making sure that they have appropriate resources to be able to live and thrive and grow. And if you have not managed those well, you will suffer the consequences thereof, which is why we need, one of so many hundreds of reasons why we need to address climate change now, and why many of you have heard I have said that instead of these global czars we have every time there's a new pandemic, we probably need a deputy secretary general of WHO who's responsible for health issues. I think it's at that level that we need to have input, not just, yes, WHO is excellent, love WHO and their partners, Ministry of Health partners, but I think these are political issues that need to be dealt with at the political level.
Well said. Well said. So, Selena, Ali's raised the bar, but you get to now be UN Secretary General, President, or Prime Minister for the day. What would you recommend that world leaders think about on these issues too?
Well, I'm actually going to bring a different spin into this, and I'm going to bring in gender. I call it the other 50% of the population, right? And those that do give birth to humans, which is key. I often say, healthy women raise healthy children, more likely to go to school, less likely to pick up an AK, right? You keep a boy with the mother for as long as possible, more likely to have empathy, less likely to rape and have other issues, right, that come along with that. So I think gender is a big component of this. And I'll give a call out to Dr. Chris Tucker, a friend of mine. He wrote this book about, I forget the name of it, but the fact that we're just, population growth on the earth is just, having such a stress factor on the earth and on resources and on climate. And, most of that goes to women who, give birth. So if you empower women and to more likely to engage in a career, or that are more healthy, they're more likely to be going out in the community and doing things, less likely to be raped. There's a whole bunch of different things about empowering women. So I would actually look at the other 50% of the population, improve the health of women, and even in disasters, who is first affected? It is women and children. And so I would actually really do a strategy around looking at gender and how we can improve our gender strategies within public health, which then has all of the flow through and will have an effect on everything else, to include, climate change and resource management and all those other things that I think then, we'll be able to improve the conditions in these countries. And I mean, women are less likely to go to war, right? So again, I think I'd take a gender approach. And, how it relates to space, I'd start training them as space engineers. So have women in space.
Well said. And I love one that you gave a shout out to like you said, the work that Chris Tucker has worked at. And I know you're passionate about it too, which is, as you said, because right now we are on a planet strained for competition for natural resources, that does fall disproportionately on the gender that does give birth. And then you also pointed out, and I know the Ghanaian culture likes to point out, it's actually in Ghana that they actually ask the women whether or not they're going to go to war or not, because it's the women's sons that are going to be asked to go forward. And so that makes them less likely to say yes to going to war. And so there's something to be said when it's a maternal instinct that's kicking in. I'm going to sort of pull one additional thread before we go to our close and our lightning round as to how we move forward. But the question I'm going to go to first is to Selena and then to Ali. The role of the private sector. I mean, obviously, Selena, you're living this in the private sector, but we've talked about what government can do. We've talked about universities and education can do. Is there a role recognizing that private sector, yes, you've got to do either ROI or you've got shareholders or things like that, but they also need to recognize that if you don't have a stable region to sell to, or if you don't have a stable region to provide services to, you won't have a long-term market. So is there a role for the private sector possibly to help with both addressing climate change here and now? I'll give one quick example before I go to you, Selena, that I have seen that there are startups now that have natural bacteria that they have sequenced through computational biology. So they selected for it naturally, that can actually use methane as a sugar source, which is great because we don't want methane blooms either through liquid or through gas form, because that's between 22 and 40 times as worse as carbon dioxide. Use methane as a sugar source, but then too, as it does so, returns nitrogen from the air back to the soil, which actually makes the soil more fertile. And that's something that could actually be done as a service through a company that actually uses either air or space-based assets to say, look, I can see there's a methane bloom from your cattle field or from whatever natural mining activities you're doing. I can also see that you're actually losing nitrogen from the soil through your agricultural practices. And then after I mitigate it with this bacteria, I can show you that it's actually the soil's been made more fertile as a result, and you've also removed some of the methane blooms. And so that's just one example of how a combination of space and a private company could actually help address some of these issues. But I know, Selena, you're living this on a daily basis, so I'm going to go to you and then to Ali and say, is there a role for the private sector to do more in this area as well to address these issues, whether it be climate change, disaster response, or public health in general?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is you don't have any customers if they're unhealthy. They're not going to be buying your product, right? So again, healthy people buy things, rising middle class buy things. So, you know, you want to be able to increase your customer base. So I think, you know, and talking about space, I mean, I think space-based technology, I think it's like 60 or 70% is commercial, right? We're not talking about government entities. I mean, the satellite that Ombra builds was illegal to build 8 years ago. And now the US government's buying data from that satellite. I mean, the US government told them 8 years ago, yeah, that's illegal. And then now they're buying data from the satellite.
Just so folks know, it was illegal because the
So,
resolution
you know,
was too high, right? Just so that everyone knows. And now the resolution is
Right.
perfectly okay.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, the benefits of that, you know, are exponential, right? Helping how many people. And I think Umbra is a great company where they're now releasing their data for free, right? That, you know, their archive data to do some of these great programs that you know, maybe NGOs can't afford to pay for the data, but they can now, you know, get access to the data through Umbra's you know, free data program. That I think is an example of where these commercial companies are now giving back. Now, yeah, there is an ROI that they do have to make money to continue, and I think that's a whole nother conversation. But I think it's not one or the other. You know, there are benefits to having a really sound approach to climate change. Again, I know in Africa, you know, there's a little bit of hesitancy to say, oh, you know, what do you mean you're going to tell me that we can't mine our assets because, you know, you're worried about, you know, the carbon footprint. Well, how do you do it more responsibly, right? It's that type of conversation. So, and I think with the data that we now have available, we can do it in a better way. I also think from like supply chain, and we didn't touch on this, but you know, at Descartes Labs, they were tracking the health of a seed and watching the seed travel through the whole supply chain, and then how it affected you know, the economic models, you know, from a bad crop to a good crop, right? If you're seeing a bad crop, you know, and say it's Cargill, right? Well, it is in the interest to provide, you know, that not only the data, but programs around that on how to improve the agricultural environment in that you know, is helpful to the whole population. So again, I think a lot of these challenges, it's not one or the other. They both live in the same realm.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate that, Selena, and I love how you pointed out that they are overlapping realms. It's not completely separate. And like you said, there are companies that are making their data available. That's one area. There's companies that what they provide in terms of agriculture or related products are very interested in this as well. So Ali, I'll go to you before we go to the final close in the lightning round, unless Michelle or Niles chimes in with any closing thoughts. But Ali, you obviously from your interaction get to work with a lot of different groups. Where do you see the private sector playing a role in the future of how we use these tools to benefit public health and public health related issues?
So I agree with you. It's not mutually exclusive, and we see commercial uses of this data currently. Ag is a good example. Disaster response is a good example. Some of our environmental health work is a good example. So we already see commercial uses, and I think it's beneficial as Umbra and others release data for public use that may not be able to be clearly monetized, right? For some of the routine public health work we do. But you know, we're fortunate that there's a lot of partners out there that for economic reasons, it's very viable. This data is very viable, and that we get to take advantage of that sometimes when it's being used for other purposes. As you said, sometimes you've used data for other purposes that turns out it's really good to monitor forest fires with.
Exactly. It's useful for forest fires and things like that too. And that was showing a proof of point in the mid-90s. So well, thank you for that, Ali. As we now go to the close, before I will turn the baton back to Michelle, we're now at the lightning round, and that's where I'm going to ask Selena and then Ali just to give us tweet links. I don't know if I can still call them tweets anymore. I don't know what it is, but short, maybe 2 to 3 short actions that you would recommend, whether you're a student of public health, a professor of public health, or someone who just cares about making public health better and how we actually use these tools. 2 to 3 short takeaways on how we move forward. Selena, if you're willing to share your thoughts, I'll go to you. You might have.
Yeah, I think
Mhm.
I just went off screen because my battery's about to die. So.
All right, that's why you get to close.
So I think what the making data easy, accessible, and data for all. I truly believe that that data should be available to everyone.
Well said. And that resonates with how we were saying throughout this, that data needs to be accessible to everyone. It needs to be in a form that they can use, so they don't have to be an expert in using synthetic aperture radar, and ultimately have some stakeholderism in the data because the data is their voice. All right, Ali, you get to bring it home for us. What would you recommend?
So my tweet would be, think of NASA as a public health partner.
Love it.
That would be my tweet.
Excellent. Well, as one who, I mean, you and I think we both interacted with NASA. I have a lot of friends there. I love that you say thinking about NASA as a public health partner. And like you said, it's about all aspects of health, including climate change, climate adaptation, and the like. With that, Michelle, back to you. A heartfelt thank you both to Ali and Selena for sharing all your expert insights, and to Emory University for hosting this great conversation. Michelle, thank you.
Yes, I would like to echo David's thanks. David, thank you to you for engaging Ali and Selena in this very enlightening conversation. I'm a little fearful now, actually, but no, just kidding. Obviously, this conversation has just really driven home for me that data that we collect from space and satellite is a very, very powerful tool, and whether it's on an aggregate or an individual level, it can really help us address and even solve so many challenges, whether it's public health or economic, environmental, safety and security, the list just goes on and on. And so this has been a very enlightening conversation, and I just want to also thank you all for your time today and for sharing your expertise. This series was created to have these type of engaging discussions and to think beyond our current state of public health, and to really think about what our future holds. And as you all have said earlier today, our public health future is right now. This is happening right now. And so embrace it, go forward, do great work. Thank you all for your time today. We'll see you in a few months with our next session.